Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. I had spent years building my dream farm, a place where I could finally escape the noise and stress of city life. 20 acres of lush, rolling fields stretched out as far as the eye could see, dotted with fruit trees, a sturdy red barn, and a cozy farmhouse that I had designed myself. Every morning, I woke up to the sounds of roosters crowing, cows mooing, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, the kind of life I had always wanted. My neighbors kept to themselves, and the small community nearby seemed friendly enough. I thought I'd found paradise. That illusion shattered the day the homeowners association showed up at my front gate. It started with a knock on my door one morning while I was feeding my chickens. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened it to find a man in a crisp suit standing there, holding a clipboard and wearing a smug expression. His name was Richard, and he introduced himself as the president of the newly expanded HOA. I barely had time to process that before he handed me a thick envelope and informed me that my property was now under their jurisdiction. Confused, I flipped through the pages. According to their documents, the HOA had voted to extend their community boundaries, and my farm had been incorporated into their domain. That meant my land, my barn, my fences, and even my livestock were subject to their rules. I frowned, barely able to believe what I was hearing. I bought my land outright, fair and square. Now, some committee of self-important neighbors wanted to dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own property. I laughed and handed the papers back to Richard, telling him that there must be some kind of mistake. But he simply adjusted his tie and smiled in that way that made my stomach turn. "This is not optional," he said. "You are now a part of the HOA, and as such, you must comply with our guidelines. Failure to do so will result in fines and potential legal action." I stood there for a moment, letting his words sink in. I had heard horror stories about HOAs before. Power-hungry boards, ridiculous rules about mailbox colors, petty fines for leaving a trash bin out too long, but I had never imagined I would be caught in their crosshairs. My farm was my livelihood, my home, and now these bureaucrats wanted to treat it like a suburban front lawn. I told Richard in no uncertain terms that I had never agreed to join any HOA and that I had no intention of following any of their so-called rules. He simply chuckled and said, "We'll see about that." Over the next few weeks, the harassment began. At first, it was subtle. I started receiving notices in the mail demanding that I bring my property into compliance. According to the HOA, my barn was an unapproved structure that needed to be torn down or modified to meet community aesthetic standards. My fencing, which had kept my animals safe for years, was apparently inconsistent with the neighborhood design, and I was ordered to replace it. Even my chickens, harmless and quiet, were subjected to scrutiny. To the barking dogs in town were labeled a nuisance. I ignored the letters at first, assuming that they would eventually give up and move on. But they didn't. The notices turned into fines, and the fines kept increasing. $500 for the fence, $750 for the bond, and $1,000 for refusing to comply. The numbers kept climbing, absurd and baseless, until I finally went to confront Richard at the HOA office. He sat behind a polished wooden desk, his fingers laced together as he smiled up at me like he had been expecting me. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "I assume you're here about the fines?" I slammed the stack of notices onto his desk. "You don't have the authority to fine me. I never signed any agreement with your HOA." Richard barely glanced at the papers. "You were annexed into the community. As such, you're subject to the same rules as everyone else." I clenched my jaw. "You can't just take my land and declare it part of your HOA. That's not how this works." His smirk widened. "Legally, it is." That was when I realized this wasn't just a game to him. He fully believed that he had the power to dictate what I could do on my own land, and he was willing to use every tool at his disposal to force me into submission. When I refused to pay the fines, the HOA took things a step further. They placed a lien on my property. I came home one day to find a bright yellow notice nailed to my fence, declaring that my farm was now considered community property due to my unpaid debts. I ripped the paper down, feeling a mix of fury and disbelief. How could this be happening? I had done nothing wrong. I had never agreed to any of their ridiculous rules. Yet now, according to them, my own land was no longer mine. The next morning, I received an official letter stating that if I did not vacate the premises within 30 days, the HOA would take legal action to seize my property and sell it to a compliant community member. That was the final straw. I wasn't just going to roll over and let them steal my farm. If they wanted to fight, I was going to give them one. But I needed a plan. I needed to find out exactly how they had managed to pull this off, and more importantly, how I could stop them. I started digging into the HOA's bylaws, looking for any loophole or flaw in their claims. What I found made my blood boil. The so-called annexation of my farm had never been properly filed with the county. There were no legal documents proving that my land had ever been part of that community. It was all a scam, a power grab orchestrated by Richard and his cronies to expand their control and squeeze money out of unwilling landowners. Armed with this information, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. When I showed him the HOA's documents, he laughed and shook his head. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on," he said. "This is fraud, plain and simple." That was all I needed to hear. The HOA thought they could intimidate me into submission, but they had underestimated me. They had picked a fight with the wrong man. My farm. I was going to make sure their entire operation crumbled. I sat in the lawyer's office, my fists clenched as he flipped through the pile of documents I had handed him. Every fine, every letter, every so-called legal notice from the HOA. He shook his head in disbelief, muttering about how absurd the whole thing was. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a smirk. "They don't have a case. None of this is legally binding. They never had the right to annex your land, and they certainly don't have the right to claim it as community property." I exhaled, feeling a momentary wave of relief, but it didn't last. "Then why the hell do they think they can get away with it?" I asked. The lawyer shrugged. "Because most people don't fight back. They see the HOA as an unstoppable force, so they fold under the pressure." He set the papers down and laced his fingers together. "But you're not going to do that, are you?" I shook my head. "Not a chance." The next morning, I found another notice taped to my front door. This one was more aggressive than the last. It declared that my continued refusal to comply with the HOA's rules was grounds for further action, including legal proceedings to enforce the payment of standing fines. I crumpled it up and tossed it aside. They wanted to play hardball? Fine, I could play too. But before I could put any plans into motion, the HOA decided to escalate things even further. Later that afternoon, as I was repairing the fence near my driveway, I saw a black luxury sedan pull up. The door opened, and out stepped a man in an expensive suit, his hair slicked back, his expression oozing arrogance. He walked toward me with a smug confidence that made my blood boil. Before he even opened his mouth, he said, "Mr. Carter," extending a hand that I didn't bother shaking. "I'm Jerry Coleman, legal counsel for the HOA. I understand there's been some resistance on your part to comply with community regulations." I wiped the sweat from my brow and crossed my arms. "That's because I'm not part of your community. Never was, never agreed to be." Jerry gave me a condescending smile, the kind a lawyer gives when he thinks he's already won. "I'm afraid that's not quite accurate. The HOA has the authority to expand its jurisdiction, and your property falls well within the newly established boundaries." I scoffed. "Yeah, show me the legal paperwork, the county records, anything that proves I ever agreed to be under your control." Jerry's smile didn't waver, but I saw a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "That's not necessary. The fact remains that your property is now subject to the same rules as every other homeowner in the community." I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So what exactly do you want?" I asked. Jerry reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope, handing it to me like he was presenting a gift. "A simple solution. The HOA is offering to purchase your land at fair market value. You'll be compensated generously, and this whole situation will be resolved without further conflict." I stared at him, barely able to believe what I was hearing. "You want me to sell my farm?" Jerry nodded. "That would be the best course of action for all parties involved." I took the envelope, glanced at the number printed on the first page, and let out a bit of a laugh. They weren't offering me a fair price. They were offering me a pit barely half of what the land was worth. They wanted to steal my farm out from under me, dress it up as a generous deal, and force me out of my own home. I tossed the envelope back at him. Not interested. Jerry sighed as if I had just made a tragic mistake. Mr. Carter, I strongly advise you to reconsider. If you refuse, the HOA will proceed with legal action. You'll be facing mounting fines, property liens, and eventual foreclosure. He smiled again, that smug, infuriating smile. It would be a shame to lose everything over a matter of principle. I took a step closer, locking eyes with him. You tell Richard and the rest of your little HOA club that I'm not going anywhere. If they want to fight, they'll get one. Jerry's smile faltered just a bit. Very well, he said, tucking his briefcase under his arm. You'll be hearing from us soon. He wasn't lying. Within days, the HOA launched an all-out war against me. It started with the usual harassment. I woke up one morning to find my mailbox missing, just gone, the post torn right out of the ground. When I went to the post office to inquire about it, the clerk told me that the HOA had reported my mailbox as unauthorized and had it removed. I had to pick up my mail in town after that. The next day, I got a notice from the county stating that multiple complaints had been filed against me for running an illegal farming operation. Apparently, someone, I wonder who, had reported my farm as violating local zoning laws. I had to spend hours dealing with bureaucrats, proving that my land was legally designated for agricultural use. Then came the water shutoff. I turned on my kitchen sink one morning, and nothing came out. Confused, I checked the pipes, the well, everything. No issues on my end. When I called the water company, they told me there was an outstanding billing dispute flagged by the HOA. Since they had officially registered my property as part of that community, they claimed they had the authority to dispute my utility payments. It took nearly a week to get it sorted, and in the meantime, I had to haul water from town just to keep my animals hydrated. Every day, the attacks kept coming, mysterious complaints, sudden inspections, random fines appearing in my mailbox. They were trying to break me down, make my life so miserable that I would have no choice but to sell and leave. But they underestimated me. Instead of scaring me, they made me angry. I started documenting everything. I installed security cameras around my property, catching HOA board members trespassing and taking photos of my land. I recorded phone calls, saved every letter, every fine, every piece of evidence. I decided to fight back. I filed formal complaints with the county, challenging the HOA's jurisdiction. I reached out to my neighbors, some of whom had their own grievances with the HOA, and we started comparing notes. The more I dug, the more corruption I uncovered. Richard, the HOA president, was using HOA funds for personal vacations. The board members were fining residents for nonsense violations and pocketing the money. Worst of all, they had never legally filed the paperwork to annex my farm into their community. They had expanded their borders on paper, but they had never gotten the county's approval. That meant every fine, every notice, every threat they had sent me was completely illegitimate. They had no legal standing, and they knew it. I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. I contacted my lawyer, and together we started building a case. If the HOA wanted a wall, I was going to give them one, but they had no idea what was coming next. I spent the next several days compiling every piece of evidence I had gathered against the HOA. My lawyer was just as eager as I was to bring them down, especially after realizing how many laws they had broken in their attempts to strong-arm me into selling my land. The more we dug, the more dirt we uncovered, and it became clear that this wasn't just about my farm. The HOA had been operating like a personal fiefdom for years, using intimidation tactics to control property owners, collecting excessive fees, and misusing funds. They had managed to get away with it because no one had dared to challenge them. That was about to change. The first step of my plan was to bait the HOA into making even bigger mistakes. I knew they were desperate to push me off my land, so I let them think I was getting frustrated. I stopped responding to their notices and ignored the fines they sent, making it look like I was on the verge of giving up. I even spread a rumor through a few neighbors that I was considering selling, just to see how the HOA would react. It worked. Within days, Richard and his goons escalated their harassment, trespassing onto my property under the guise of an inspection and making comments about how this place would look better with some modern upgrades. That was exactly what I needed. I had installed hidden cameras around my property after their first attempt to claim my land, and now I had clear video evidence of them illegally entering my property. Even better, one of the HOA board members let slip that they planned to rezone the land for community use once they got rid of me. That was a direct admission that they were illegally trying to seize my property. My lawyer nearly jumped out of his seat when he saw the footage. "This is gold," he said, rewinding the video to double-check the audio. They just admitted to committing fraud on camera. With that, we moved to phase 2 of the plan. I filed an official complaint with the county, providing them with every document proving that the HOA had never legally annexed my land. I also submitted video evidence of their trespassing and their blatant admission of their illegal intentions. County officials took one look at my case and immediately launched an investigation. Suddenly, the HOA had a much bigger problem on their hands. Richard must have caught wind that something was wrong because the very next day, Jerry, the HOA lawyer, showed up at my door again. He was no longer smug and confident. Instead, he seemed tense, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Carter, we seem to have had some misunderstandings," he started, his tone almost apologetic. "The HOA is willing to reassess some of the fines if you're open to negotiation." I let him talk, nodding along as if I was considering his offer. Then I casually mentioned that I had filed a complaint with the county, and their expressions changed instantly. Jerry's fake smile disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "That was unnecessary," he said stiffly. "We could have handled this internally." I leaned against my door frame and shrugged. "I don't see how you illegally expanded your HOA without proper authorization. You've been fining me for violations that don't exist, and now the county is involved. Seems like a pretty big problem for you." Jerry tried to backpedal, claiming that there must have been some administrative mix-ups and that the fines were just a standard procedure, but I wasn't buying it. I shut the door in his face and let them sweat. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. The HOA had stopped sending me notices, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't waking up to new fines. That was when I knew they were up to something. I decided to pay a visit to a few of my neighbors, especially those who had complained about the HOA in the past. It didn't take long to find out what was going on. The HOA had started pressuring other homeowners, trying to rally them against me. They told people that I was threatening the integrity of the community and that if I won my case, it would lead to chaos and property devaluation. It was the oldest trick in the book: turn the neighborhood against the one person standing up to them. But the HOA had miscalculated. People were tired of their nonsense. When I spoke with my neighbors, many of them admitted that they had also been hit with unfair fines over the years. One elderly couple told me that the HOA had fined them over $2,000 for lawn discoloration when their grass had dried out during heat wave. Another family said they were forced to repaint their house 3 times in 1 year because the HOA kept changing its mind about approved colors. The more people I spoke to, the more it became clear that I wasn't the only victim. With the support of several neighbors, I gathered more statements, turning what had started as a personal fight into a full-blown community revolt. We compiled a detailed report listing all the HOA's violations, their history of harassment, and the evidence of financial mismanagement. Then I took it one step further. I contacted the local. Nothing makes corrupt organizations panic faster than public exposure. A reporter was more than happy to cover the story, especially after seeing the video footage of the HOA board members trespassing on my land. Within days, the story was all over town. "Local HOA accused of illegal property seizures" was the headline, and the article detailed everything: the fines, the intimidation, the fraudulent annexation. Richard and his board members were suddenly under a microscope, and they knew it. That was when the real panic set in. I got a call from Jerry, who was now sounding downright desperate. "Mr. Carter, there's no need for all this hostility," he said, trying to sound calm. "I'm sure we can come to a reasonable agreement." I pretended to consider it for a moment before replying, "Sure, I'll agree to something. I'll agree to see you in court." Richard himself showed up at my farm the next day, looking haggard and worn down. He wasn't smug anymore. He He was pleading. "This has gotten out of hand," he said, trying to regain some authority. "We just want to resolve things amicably." I looked at him expressionless. Amicably? Like how you tried to steal my land. Like how you harassed me for weeks. He stammered, trying to justify their actions, but it was too late. The county's investigation was in full swing, and with the news coverage adding fuel to the fire, the HOA was drowning in legal trouble. I knew the end was coming, but I wasn't done yet. I had one more move to make, one final blow to ensure they never pulled something like this again. My lawyer had uncovered something even bigger, evidence that Richard and his board had been skimming money from the HOA's funds for years, funneling it into private accounts. Armed with this information, I sent everything to the state's HOA regulatory board. The moment Richard realized what was happening, the color drained from his face. He knew he wasn't just facing community backlash anymore. He was facing real legal consequences. I watched him walk away, shoulders slumped, and I knew it was over. The war wasn't finished yet, but the HOA had just lost its biggest battle. The fallout from the investigation hit the HOA like a wrecking ball. The county officials had taken my complaint seriously, and once they started digging, they realized just how deep the corruption ran. The first sign that things are going downhill for Richard and his cronies was when county auditors showed up at the HOA's office demanding to see financial records. Rumors spread fast, and within days, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Some of the homeowners who had previously been intimidated by the HOA's tactics started coming forward with their own complaints. Suddenly, the organization that had terrorized the community for years was the one on the defensive. I kept my distance, letting the legal system do its work, but I kept receiving updates from my lawyer and a few neighbors who were gleefully watching the HOA crumble. Apparently, Richard had been trying to down. The severity of the situation was reassuring homeowners that everything was just a minor misunderstanding. That illusion shattered when the county officially launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's finances. The news spread like wildfire, and suddenly, people who had been too scared to speak up before were more than happy to share their grievances. More residents came forward with proof of excessive fines, fraudulent fees, and even instances where the HOA had threatened to foreclose on homes over minor infractions. The best part was seeing how quickly people adapted to then find freedom. Some homeowners wasted no time in tearing down the unnecessary restrictions the HOA had forced on them. One neighbor, who had been fined repeatedly for growing vegetables in his front yard, expanded his garden, turning it into a beautiful and thriving space. Another, who had been forced to remove a small shed because it wasn't in compliance with aesthetic guidelines, rebuilt it even bigger than before, just out of spite. Everywhere I looked, people were reclaiming their homes, undoing years of unnecessary restrictions that had been forced upon them. For me, the victory felt even sweeter. Each time I looked out over my land, the farm that had been my dream for so long was still standing, untouched by the HOA's greed. The bee that they had once tried to have demolished remained exactly where it belonged. My fences, my animals, my land, it was all mine, without question, without interference. It was a reminder of what I had fought for, what I had refused to let them take away. Every morning, when I stepped outside and breathed in the crisp air, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that I had stood my ground and won. Richard, on the other hand, had completely vanished from the area after the HOA was shut down and the financial investigation revealed just how much he had embezzled. He had no choice but to flee. Word had it that he had packed up in the dead of night and left town before the lawsuits against him could fully take shape. No one knew exactly where he went, but the general consensus was that he had moved out of state to escape the consequences of his actions. The legal troubles, however, followed him. Homeowners who had been financially drained by his fraudulent fees and fines weren't letting him off the hook that easily. Several former residents banded together and filed lawsuits against him personally, seeking to recover the money he had stolen. As far as I was concerned, that was just as well deserved. The other board members tried to salvage what they could of their reputations, but it was a lost cause. Some of them attempted to defend themselves, claiming they had only been following orders, but nobody believed them. Others simply went silent, hoping to fade into the background now that their positions of power were gone. One or two even tried to join in on the efforts to dissolve the HOA, acting as if they had been against Richard the whole time. But everyone saw through the act. Their names had been attached to too many bad decisions, too many unjust fines and threats. No one was interested in forgiving them. The best part of the entire ordeal came a few weeks after the HOA's collapse when I received another letter from the county. This time it wasn't a warning, a fine, or a demand. It was an official notification that due to the numerous legal violations committed by the HOA, the county had revoked all of their previous rulings and restrictions. That meant that not only was my land permanently free from any HOA control, but all properties that had previously been under their rule were now outside of any HOA jurisdiction. In other words, the homeowners were free. The association that had controlled so many lives for years had been completely wiped out, and nothing would be replacing it. I wasn't the only one celebrating. The news spread quickly, and the neighborhood decided that it was worth throwing a real party over. The idea started with a few homeowners talking about hosting a small gathering, but as word spread, it turned into a full-blown event. People who had barely spoken to each other before the HOA's downfall were now coming together, planning food, music, and entertainment. Someone suggested hosting at my farm, and I happily agreed. After all, it had started with my fight, and it only seemed right that we all celebrated our victory together. On the day of the event, my farm was livelier than it had ever been. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to even acknowledge each other were now chatting like old friends. Families set up picnic blankets, kids ran around playing games, and the air was filled with the smell of grilled food. I had set up a barbecue pit, making sure to bring out the best cuts of meat for the occasion. People brought homemade dishes, desserts, and drinks, turning the entire thing into a true community feast. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a real place of belonging, not just a collection of houses bound by restrictive rules. Throughout the day, people took turns sharing their own stories of dealing with the HOA. Some were frustrating, others downright ridiculous, but all of them had one thing in common: the relief that it was finally over. One man talked about how he had been fined for having a non-regulation garden hose. Another woman recalled how she had been written up for leaving her curtains open at night, something the HOA had deemed disruptive to neighborhood aesthetics. Hearing all of these experiences made me realize just how much damage the HOA had done over the years, how many people had been forced to live under constant stress and unnecessary control. At one point during the celebration, a few people gathered around me, raising their glasses in a toast. Someone joked that I should run for mayor, while another called me the HOA Slayer, which got a good laugh from the crowd. I just shook my head and smiled, taking it all in. I hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. I had just wanted to protect my farm, to keep what was rightfully mine. But in doing so, I had helped free an entire community from years of oppression, and that, more than anything, felt like the real victory. As the evening wound down and the guests slowly started heading home, I took a moment to stand at the edge of my property, looking out over the land I had fought so hard to keep. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt right. There was no more looming threat, no more battles to fight, just me, my farm, and a future that was finally secure. Over the next few months, things continued to improve. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, homeowners started making changes that truly reflected their personalities and needs. Some added fences, others put in new landscaping, and a few even painted their homes in bold colors that would have made the old HOA board faint. The community had changed, not just in structure, but in spirit. People were happier, more open, and more willing to help each other. It was as if a weight had been lifted, allowing everyone to finally breathe. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized something important. The HOA had operated on fear, on intimidation, on making people believe they were powerless. But the moment people stood up and refused to back down, the entire system crumbled. That was the real lesson in all of this. No matter how powerful or untouchable an organization might seem, they only have control if people allow them to. And once that illusion is shattered, once people realize they have the power to fight back, there's nothing that can stop them. As I walked back toward my house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The battle was over, the fight won, and the future ahead was mine to shape. No one was ever going to take that away from me again.